So now let's turn our attention to some groups that are neither gender or race-based. For example, the elderly. Age classifications are not suspect, but they fall under a rational basis test. So basically, you just have to prove that it makes sense to discriminate based on age. But keep in mind, you can sue on the idea that you didn't get a job because of your age. If you can prove that, you could win that case. And of course, older people have a very powerful political voice because they vote so much, and they're becoming an increasingly larger and larger group because we're living longer and longer, right? And some people have begun to ask the question, are young people a discriminated group? And so we've seen children's rights movements and arguments, and we've seen things like children divorcing their families are becoming emancipated from their families if they're not being treated right. And so that's become an issue as well. Civil rights and people with disabilities. The Americans Disabilities Act of 1990, which was an unfunded mandate, I might remind you from our federalism chapter, required employees in public facilities to make reasonable accommodations for those with disabilities. Well, this is a civil rights case. It also prevents employment discrimination against the disabled. Unless you can show that it will prevent them from performing the job, you cannot deny someone a right based on a disability. If a disabled, if somebody in a wheelchair wants to be an NFL quarterback, you could show that that will prevent them from doing the job, unfortunately. But if somebody wants to be a teacher, per se, or let's say, you can't really prove that's going to prevent them from being an effective teacher, so you don't have the option of denying them employment based on that. Of course, gay and lesbians have the LGBT community, I guess I should say, has asserted their rights. And they've had a tough battle. This is kind of the new frontier in civil rights. We've seen this recently with things like allowing LGBT folks into the military. And gay marriage, of course, has become a big issue lately. So one of the arguments here is this a choice or is this a condition of birth? If it's a condition of birth, we generally agree that it should be protected, just like race. If it's a matter of people who believe it's a matter of choice would argue that if you choose to live your life like that, then you face the consequences. One of the places this has really come up is in the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which was recently repealed. But this was a policy that said you can be in the military, and the military cannot ask if you're gay. But if you tell them you're gay, or if they find out accidentally, they can throw you out for being gay. Now, this actually many LGBT people felt this was a violation of their civil rights, but it really became a problem when social networking came around, and it became a lot easier to kind of peek into other people's lives. And we just saw story after story of somebody going and looking at someone's Facebook and figuring out they were gay, and then reporting it to their commanding officer, and they're getting thrown out of the military. But the Obama administration and Congress repealed this, and now, of course, LGBT people can serve openly in the armed forces. The Lawrence v. Texas case it cites here says that states can't outlaw homosexual acts. Most states in our union used to simply make it illegal to participate in gay sexual acts. But that has actually been overturned by the Supreme Court in Lawrence v. Texas, 2003. And finally, of course, we've talked about DOMA and the right for gay folks to marry. And federal courts have recently been making rulings fairly consistently that this is a violation of civil rights, and so we expect that to get to the Supreme Court and be settled, I think, any year now. We expect to see that happen. Finally, let's talk about affirmative action. Affirmative action is a policy that essentially, in one way or another, sets aside spots for a disadvantaged group. Now, for example, the University of California, Davis, had a medical school, and they had 100 slots in the medical school, and 20, and a number of them, I don't know if it was 20, some number of them were specifically set aside for minority groups, for historically disadvantaged groups, as they're often called. And a white guy who would have got in if this system wasn't in place sued. And he said, I outperformed these folks and I should have gotten in. And he won. And this threw out traditional affirmative action programs where we're going to hire 20 people and 3 of them have to be black and 2 have to be a woman and this sort of thing. So as a workaround, we began to see programs like the University of Michigan implemented where they had a point system, and you got points for your grades and points for your SAT scores and points for the difficulty of your classes, and they would give 20 points for being in a historically disadvantaged group to give those people a leg up. Well, the Supreme Court threw that out as well. And then we began to turn to things like the University of Texas has had until recently, which is where you take the top percentage of every school in the state. So we started out as the top 10% of every high school in Texas. And what that did was, that meant 10% of Westlake could go, and 10% of Aikens could go, and 10% of Reagan can go. If you're not from the area, those are schools with very different demographic populations. And it created some degree of racial balance. Now, last year, the Supreme Court threw that out as well. And so actually, a lot of state schools, including the University of Texas here in Austin, are in a real state of flux because they've been ordered by the Supreme Court to get rid of their current admission system and replace it with something new. And I have not been able to find out, and I've looked what that system is going to be, but the current admission system for the University of Texas anyway is unconstitutional according to the Supreme Court, and they are the ones that decide after all. In employment, quotas to remedy past discrimination are considered constitutional. And this is the United Steelworkers v. Weber case, where they established an employee manager training program for minorities because there were no minority managers, and some white workers sued on the basis of discrimination. And they said, well, this is the only way we can figure out how to get minorities into management, so they allowed it. In Adirondack Constructors v. Pena in 1995, they narrowed what was allowable through affirmative action. It didn't ban affirmative action, but it severely limited the circumstances under which it could be performed, and really did away with most things we consider affirmative action.